Okay, and then the fourth area we're looking for in relation to communication is called a lack of varied, spontaneous make-believe or social imitative play appropriate to developmental level. Going back to that issue of literal language and concreteness, a lot of kids with autism are interested in toys, but they play only in a functional manner. You know, toward the end of the second year of life, most children are beginning to engage in imaginary play, or what we call symbolic play. Children, some kids with autism can be very bright, but never learn or cultivate an imagination, and it's reflected in their play. And being able to play an imaginary level has a direct impact on the development of more abstract language and figurative and non-literal language. So we look at how kids play, whether or not they begin to use toys spontaneously, or whether they play with toys in a repetitive manner, whether they animate toys and, we'll have teddy bears talk to one another, whether or not, their play is elaborated upon, or whether they use the toys in the same manner over and over. A lot of kids with autism, particularly the boys, love cars, they love trains, and they play with them the same way in a repetitive manner. We're looking at children who are responsive to the play that is modeled and demonstrated beside them, whether they expand their play themes or whether they continue to do the same thing over and over with toys. So not animating objects, not developing dialogue between dolls or toy figures. Those are the things we look at to determine whether a child has moved to the realm of imaginary play. And then this third realm that I'm talking about is the restrictive, repetitive, and stereotypic patterns of behavior, interest, and activity. So here's what we're looking for in those domains. Number one is looking at an encompassing preoccupation with one or more stereotyped and restricted patterns of interest that's abnormal either in intensity or focus. Now, we really want our kids to be impassioned by what they do and what they're interested in, but once again, it has to do with the intensity. If you have a child who's asking the same question repetitively because they want to talk about a topic over and over and they're unresponsive to an answer and they keep coming back to the same place. If you have a child who develops special interests that are very much predicated upon rote memory or doing the same thing over and over in the course of activity and talk. We also look at whether people amass great amounts of facts that they utilize in their discussion with others or even in their play activities. So what we're really looking at is people who have a very narrow range of interest, that are very intense and focused about it, and also who are unwilling to get involved in other types of activities if that's what other people's preference is. The second category is apparently inflexible adherence to specific non-functional routines or rituals. It's important to understand, even though I talked to you about rigidity and problems with transition and change earlier, some autistic kids are so easy, they have a temperament that they're much more flexible than many kids who don't have autism. So what we're looking at is, are there kids who have to have specific details maintained? Do they have to sit in the same seat at the dinner table? Do they have to have their fork on the left as opposed to the right? If something is broken or blemished, if there's a scratch on their favorite cup, do you have to discard the cup because it's no longer the way they envision it's supposed to be? Do we have kids who wear the same clothes day in and day out, and parents who have to wash their children's clothes every day because they won't wear anything else? We also look at the ability to adapt to routines. Kids who, I have some kids who are very aware of how their parents drive them to school, and if their parents take an alternative route, they have a meltdown in the car because they know how to get to school and it's not as they anticipate. Do we have a child who has problems if you give them their bath before dinner or after dinner? We really look at kids who have a very narrow range of food or interest in food or a very narrow repertoire of activities they'll engage in. But once again, some kids with autism are so flexible and easygoing, this particular criteria is not really responsive to how we would describe them. The third area has to do with stereotyped and repetitive motor mannerisms, hand or finger flapping or twisting or whole body movements. Now, a lot of kids who have autism, when they're overstimulated, they flap. They engage in this kind of behavior. A lot of kids have visual stims where they're looking at things in a peculiar way. For diagnostic purposes, very often I see young boys who, when they're rolling a car or train on the ground, they put their head on the ground because they want to look at the wheels from ground level rather than appreciate the fullness of what's involved in rolling a train around the track. A lot of kids with autism may wander aimlessly, and then on the flip side, you have some kids where if you put them somewhere, they'll stay there for 2 hours without moving unless you direct them to do something different. So we're really looking at grinding, tapping parts of their own body, tapping objects, and that's the kind of repetitive motor mannerisms or stereotypies that we look at to fulfill this criteria. And the fourth criteria relates to persistent preoccupation with parts of objects. You know, a lot of kids are overly attached to objects, not just a blankie or bottle that they carry around. There's some children who have favorite toys who have to have 1 or 2 objects in each hand as they move from one place to another. And if you try to take that toy away, it's very, very difficult for them. We look at kids who collect things. I have a lot of kids who along the schoolyard, instead of playing with other children, are wandering the perimeter. They're coming up with sticks, they're coming up with paper clips, they're finding rubber bands. They come home with their pockets filled every day because they're generating collections for no apparent purpose. We also look at whether kids arrange things in a particular order. You know, one of the things very often we look at is, and ask parents, is your child lining up things in a straight line? Do they get upset if you change the order in which they're putting things? We also look at kids who are interested in parts of object as opposed to the whole. So for instance, I have a playhouse in my office that I utilize, you know, during the course of my sessions with children. If I have a child who doesn't want to play with the house and begin to put objects in it or characters in it, but simply wants to ring the doorbell repetitively, that's the kind of indicator that I might look at. Another thing I might look at is, I have some kids, you know, who are very interested in the attributes of objects or of people. So I have kids who are memorizing airplane schedules, who memorize license plates, who are really into colors or numbers, or at an early age become obsessed or perseverate on the alphabet. And so those are different ways to meet the criteria. So I know I've gone through this relatively quickly, but so those are the 12 criteria that we look for diagnosing autism. Now, some of the other things that we need to take into consideration is that there also have to be delays or abnormal functioning in at least one of the areas that I mentioned above, with the onset prior to 3 years of age. Generally, autism is recognizable before the child hits his or her 3rd birthday. Now, one of the things that's problematic is sometimes I'm called upon to diagnose adults. You know, sometimes adults whose parents have been dead for many years. Obviously, I cannot go back retroactively and have any idea about what they're like when they're 3. And in those circumstances, you look at a pattern of behavior that's been sustained over time, but you certainly can't meet that consideration. But the 3 areas, once again, that we look at are social interaction, language as used in social communication, or symbolic or imaginary play. Now, one last thing is that we need to address before we make a diagnosis of autism is that the disturbance isn't better accounted for by something called Rett's disorder or childhood disintegrative disorder, which are pervasive developmental disorders also, but they have a different maturational framework and developmental profile than individuals with autism. So those are basically the criteria we look at, and as you listen to me, I bet you could see that somewhere in each of those 12 criteria you find yourself. So that's why, number one, we talk about qualitative impairments. That's why we really understand that there's a broad range of variability for individuals who are similarly diagnosed with autism, and we also come to understand that it really often is a matter of degree. And that's where the diagnostic process sometimes becomes most difficult.